Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. My guest tonight is Jeff Kucharski. He is an adjunct professor at Royal Roads University, and he's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's written a couple of really interesting articles that I've read lately about Canada's relations with China, with Taiwan, some issues on international trade, and also on energy. So we're going to cover numerous different issues today, but I want to start, Jeff, if I could, by asking you a little bit about what should we do if China attacks Taiwan? What's our role? What can we do today, and what should we be thinking about doing in the future?
Well, China attacking Taiwan is certainly a possibility. It's not one that many analysts think is likely in, say, the next 5 years. It wouldn't be in China's interest to do that because it would be extremely disruptive to trade in the South China Sea, which would affect China as well as all of us here in Canada. But it's certainly a possibility. Xi Jinping has made a lot of statements, threatening kinds of statements against Taiwan, has not ruled out the use of force, and is actively, exerting coercive tactics on Taiwan. So I was there actually myself in August, shortly after Nancy Pelosi arrived. And so I was a firsthand witness to the tensions that were created by China's war games and moves around Taiwan after her visit. So it's certainly possible. I think we need to be very concerned in Canada because billions of dollars of goods that go to Canada and come from Canada pass through that region. And the security of Taiwan is important to global peace, not just in the South China Sea, but throughout that part of the world, which is a critical trading partner of Canada's, but also where many of our partners and allies are, such as Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan too.
Why? Why is it important to global peace?
Well, because first of all, you've got a very large proportion of the population in the world living in that region. It's the fastest growing region in the world economically. It's going to be the most important place for Canada in terms of doing business, trade, investment, even security going forward in this century. So for many reasons, the Indo-Pacific, as we call it now, which includes India in this grouping, and India is soon to surpass China in terms of population and even economic growth. Is the greatest opportunity, but also a lot of concerns over stability. So Canada has a role to play in helping stabilize the region for our own.
But why Taiwan in specific? Why protecting Taiwan, defending Taiwan? Why do you say that's important to world peace?
Well, because Taiwan is a progressive liberal democracy, as Canada is. And right now in the world, we're faced with, we're being confronted by authoritarian regimes in Russia, in China. Russia has waged a war in Ukraine. China is threatening Taiwan. China has tensions with other countries and has claims, illegitimate ones, quite frankly, over parts of the South China Sea that other countries there feel are legitimately theirs. So Taiwan plays a kind of a central role in the South China Sea. It's a beacon of democracy. It's stable. They have the world's largest source of advanced semiconductors. And they are a close partner of the West, including Canada, the US, and other countries. So it's in our interest to preserve that democracy and the rule of law and the things that we stand for, our values, are reflected in our support for Taiwan.
Tell us a little bit about Taiwan, if you could, because I'm not sure if everyone is familiar. You said you visited there recently. I have not visited Taiwan recently, but I have visited there. And I was, impressed by the population, the size, the vibrancy of Taipei. I went on a high-speed rail from Taipei down to Sun Moon Lake. It's a very populous, prosperous advanced democracy, is it not?
Yes, it is. It's very much so. And I think it's even getting stronger in that respect. I don't know when you were there, but having just come back from there this past summer, I can tell you that the people there are determined to preserve what they built. As you say, it's a strong liberal democracy. They share a lot of values with Canadians. They're trying to build a strong country. It's not a country per se, but it is a nation. And they see themselves as distinct from mainland Chinese. And so really, because Taiwan has been evolving sort of separately from the mainland since World War II, it's now become a very unique place itself, and people want to preserve it naturally. And so they're very keen on doing it. They've built a lot of institutions, human rights. They have a human rights commissioner. They have demonstrations are allowed, free speech is allowed. And they have elections where people are elected democratically without corruption. So I mean, these are kinds of things that I think we want to help support as Canadians.
But you say it's not a country. China thinks it's part of China, would like it to be part of China. So how do you defend something that is not really a country?
Well, Canada has what we call a one China policy, which is that we took note when China declared that Taiwan was an integral part of mainland China. Canada took note of that, but it did not acknowledge that Taiwan was a part of China. Nonetheless, we recognize that there is one government that governs China. And so
But there isn't. There's two governments, right? Taiwan does have
Taiwan has its own
government.
Taiwan has its own government, yes. And so from their perspective, they are, already de facto independent. But for the purposes of international relations, Canada recognized that mainland China in Beijing represents Greater China, which includes Taiwan, even though we don't necessarily acknowledge that Taiwan is an integral part of China. So it's a kind of a nuanced way of thinking about it. Nonetheless, we don't have, Canada doesn't, and many other countries don't have a formal embassy in Taiwan. What we have is a trade office, we call it, but it acts very similar to an embassy. And our relations with Taiwan are focused mainly on trade, investment, and other things, and not much on the political side. And our kind of view, I guess, is to see how the relationship evolves, but we continue to support Taiwan's democratic values.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Dr. Jeff Kucharski. Is that correct? Kucharski?
That's right.
In just 2 minutes. And we're going to talk a little bit about Canada's new Indo-Pacific strategy and what he thinks about that. And then maybe a little bit about energy. Back in 2. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The topic for tonight's discussion is Taiwan, Asia, China, Indo-Pacific policy that Canada has recently changed, and maybe even we'll talk a little bit about energy. Our guest is Dr. Professor Jeff Kucharski. This man has got one unbelievably impressive resume. If I could just tell you, he's an adjunct professor at Royal Roads University in Victoria, British Columbia. He's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's been a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He's worked for numerous years in the Department of Energy and Government in Alberta as assistant deputy minister, executive lead, etc. And then, kind of interesting, we're going to have to talk about this later. You've got a doctor of energy science from Kyoto University. That must have been kind of interesting. Information Management Technology at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Executive Management Program at Harvard Business School, an MBA from Alberta School of Business, and a BCom Business Administration and Commerce at the University of Alberta. What do you teach, sir?
I'm teaching international business courses right now.
Focused on Asia or everywhere?
Well, international business covers the whole globe. So we talk about trade and commerce around the world. But I do also teach courses in doing business in the Indo-Pacific region. And as part of that, I take my students to Asia for a practicum.
Where did you go?
This year, we're going to Japan and Vietnam. Two interesting places. And we've been there before. To Japan, we've been several times, but this time we're, for the first time, going to Vietnam.
I did a crazy thing in the middle of my career. At one point in time, I went back to try to do a part-time doctorate in business and did a couple of weeks at Fudan University in Shanghai, doing business, international business courses, and doing business in China, doing business in Asia, etc. What an incredibly interesting experience, and what an incredible part of the world. If we get time, we should talk a little bit about Vietnam and what's happening there. But I wanted to turn, if I could, sir, to this new policy that Canada's come out with, the Indo-Pacific policy, and you also talked about the authoritarian countries, Russia, China, etc., and both our deputy prime minister and our Minister of Foreign Affairs have sort of come out with different sort of points of view about how we deal with authoritarian governments worldwide, almost less idealistic, more realistic kind of point of view. Tell me what you think about this change of attitude the Canadian government has to authoritarian countries, governments, and also to an Indo-Pacific strategy.
Yeah, you're right. Absolutely, Brian. That the government has sort of evolved in its thinking about this. For many, many years, Canada was very focused on focusing on commercial relationships in our international relations, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. And so things like our values and upholding the rule of law, democracy, and so on didn't play as strong a role. But I think with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, that really created a watershed moment and a kind of wake-up call for the Canadian government. And add to that, I think that Canada is experiencing a lot of pressure, especially from the United States, but also from our European allies, to step up its game in terms of defense, support for Ukraine, and more broadly, taking on a more robust role in its engagement with the rest of the world, particularly when we're talking about, authoritarian regimes like Russia, but also China and others. So Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland made that speech in Washington, which was well received. She's spoken quite openly about her views of upholding the international rules-based order and coming from a position of strength, even in Canada, in the past, when she talked about Canada's defense strategy. But she did it again in Washington. And it's interesting that her stance is much more, clearer, stronger, and more robust than almost anything we've heard from the Prime Minister, although he himself is now talking more like this.
Do you think those are her personal views, or are they the views of the Canadian government?
I think they're her personal views, absolutely. To what extent are they the views of the Canadian government is in some question. I mean, a lot of people think there are wide differences of opinion about this new stance around the cabinet table. But certainly as Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland has a lot of influence, and I don't think she would have said things like that without some support from the Prime Minister and others. So I'm hopeful that this is actually going to represent a new way of Canada, showing up in the world.
Okay, what about this new Indo-Pacific strategy that some people think was a long time coming?
Yeah, this strategy has been talked about now for, I think, 2.5, 3 years, and we've been expecting it. Many of us expecting it for some time, and there was a fair bit of criticism of the government that they weren't coming out with it. But I think they simply couldn't delay it anymore. And another reason perhaps that it was delayed was, well, one reason I think was to get past the Meng Wanzhou issue and the two Michaels, which is now behind us. And then trying to be aligned with the US strategy vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific, particularly vis-a-vis China. And I think the Canadian government has now shown that it is committed to being aligned with US policy. That doesn't mean that we will have the same policies, but it does mean that we will be working with the US together on, critical elements of it. And I think there were some close consultations between Ottawa and Washington before we came up with the strategy. So I do think that this is a positive move, and better late than never.
How is it different than our past strategy?
Well, in the past, we really didn't have an explicit strategy that was written down. At least we haven't seen anything like this in several decades, quite frankly. So it's probably the most detailed and cohesive strategy vis-a-vis that region that I've seen in my career, although there have been other white papers and other suggestions for strategies. So this is a step forward. We haven't had a strategy, I guess, because historically Canada has looked at itself more as an Atlantic nation, looking across the Atlantic Ocean to our NATO allies, to Europe. And so we've had that sort of eastward, if you will, look in our foreign policy. But I think this is now changing with the importance of the Indo-Pacific rising, with the tensions there, certainly with China's growing influence in the region. So it's kind of a coming to reality moment for Canada, bringing out this strategy.
So, from a business, you teach international business, from a business person standpoint, how does this change anything that we would do with China, Japan, India, Vietnam, et cetera? Or does it?
Well, I think the value in having a strategy like this is setting a vision and a direction, and sending a signal to Canadian business in particular that there are huge opportunities in the region that Canada can take advantage of, utilizing the trade agreements that we have in place, and we do have a number of them. The most prominent one, of course, is the CPTPP, or Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which ties together Canada with 10 other countries in that region and opens up their markets to Canadian goods and services. And so, the Canadian government through this strategy is planning to add some resources on the ground in some of these countries, and some other programs to help and assist Canadian firms access these markets for our products and services, but also promote investment from the region into Canada. So, I think, these kinds of things are important for Canada. They help grow our GDP. They help create jobs. They help, make our relationships with countries in the region closer, and thereby we all benefit as a result.
The United States, Australia, England seem to have an association that wasn't welcoming to Canada for a while for some reason. Can you tell us a little bit about that at all?
Yeah, I think you're referring to AUKUS. This is a new kind of security grouping that was formed in Asia that is really formed by Australia and the United States principally. The main objective originally was to help the Australians get hold of nuclear-powered submarines. So they will be building nuclear-powered submarines based on U.S. design and with U.S. technical support, which is the first time the United States has done this. And they're doing it because of the perceived threats from China in the region. But that's not the only thing. I know our Prime Minister has said that Canada is not really an interest in joining AUKUS because it is mainly a submarine deal. But actually, that's not quite true. And so there are other things like artificial intelligence and other areas of technology that Canada has some expertise in and could benefit from being a part of. And so I think there may be some discussions now about Canada potentially joining, but these are sort of going on quietly, and I haven't seen anything in the news yet.
Australia seems to have had a far tougher stance vis-a-vis China than Canada has, and yet they're a lot closer and have had a lot more trade, one would think, with China. Has the Australian strategy been a better strategy? Has it worked better than the Canadian strategy?
Well, part of this is due to geography, right? I mean, just as Canada is a neighbor of the United States and the US has the largest economy in the world, and therefore our biggest trading partner is the United States, Australia is relatively close to China, and its biggest trading partner is China. And so they naturally need to look at China, despite the fact that China is, a communist country. They need to maintain some semblance of a relationship with China because it's in their economic interest in particular. On the security side, of course, they're much closer to the United States and the West. So there is a natural tension there. But yeah, that basically geography explains why, Australia is much more attentive to and oriented to countries in East Asia, because they depend on those countries for their exports, as a source of investment. And so, for many years, they've had to work closely in that region out of necessity. And so they have, I think, a much deeper appreciation for and understanding of the region than Canada does.
There's been some controversy recently that there's been a CSIS report that China played a role in influencing some of the campaigns in the last federal election. Do you believe those? Do you think it happened? And what should we do about it if it did?
Well, I've been following Joanna Chu's work, who's a really good investigative reporter out of Vancouver, for several years, and she wrote a book about this a year or so ago. And even before that, she was talking about it, she and others. So this is not something new, and it's fairly widely known that the Chinese government, through their proxies in Canada, have been trying to influence Canadian policy vis-a-vis China. The revelation that there actually is money involved going to campaigns is something that I haven't seen before. It's worrying. Quite frankly, it's something we need to urgently address. And China does this not only in Canada, but they've been actively doing this for many years in Australia, and it caused a huge political firestorm there in the past few years. And so as a result, the Australians came up with a lot of new laws and policies to stop this kind of behavior. And that got China quite angry, actually. So China-Australia relations went into the dumpster for a couple of years at least. Now, things are recovering a little bit now. But yes, China does do these influence operations. They do them in various countries around the world, and they see it, I guess, in their interest to try to have friendly policies towards China.
Do you think it could have actually changed the outcome of the federal election?
Well, from what I've read, it would appear that it wouldn't have really changed the outcome of the election, but the mere fact that they are doing this now, and if we don't do anything about stopping it, they could change influence an election in the future, and that's extremely worrisome.
I got to ask you, since you're so knowledgeable about China and things, is there a genocide going on in China today?
I think that what's going on in Xinjiang, where the Uyghur minority is by some definitions a genocide. Yes, I do. I mean, this is the Chinese government is very afraid of minority groups that are different than the Han Chinese majority, and Xi Jinping himself is very averse to any kind of instability, and he defines that quite broadly. So, even COVID demonstrations would be extremely worrying to the Chinese government. But what they're doing in Xinjiang is over the top and is certainly a human rights violation. So yes, I think this is genocidal, and I think the world needs to continue to call them out on this.
Should Canada be doing something different?
Well, I think Canada has called out China, although certainly the legislature has, but the parliament has, I should say, but not the government itself, in terms of calling it a genocide, perhaps for political reasons. But what Canada could do is enforce its import laws more strictly. And so we have laws that should prevent, products made from forced labor, for example, into the country. But in fact, these products continue to flow into Canada, and they're not being stopped at the border. And so we need to enforce the laws we already have in place.
We're chatting tonight with Professor Jeff Kucharski, adjunct professor at Royal Roads University, and a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute about Canada-Chinese relations, Taiwan, Vietnam, Indo-Pacific strategy, etc. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes. And I'm going to ask Dr. Crombie about energy, because that's another one of his major concerns and topics. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Dr. Jeff Kucharski, who is an adjunct professor at Royal Roads University. He's also a senior fellow at Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's an expert in Asia, China, Indo-Pacific issues, and we've been chatting a little bit about that. But he's also got a big expertise in energy, especially in the energy area, energy security, energy transitions, and the geopolitics of energy. I understand that you worked for numerous years in the Department of Energy in Alberta, where you were the Assistant Deputy Minister. Tell me, what do you think about our energy strategy today? We've got a provincial government in Alberta that it would appear, for lots of reasons, but energy being one of them, maybe even wants to separate from the rest of Canada, has a sovereignty act that they've recently passed. We've got some people saying that liquefied natural gas is the solution to a lot of geopolitical issues, and we should be piping it across Canada and shipping it across the Atlantic Ocean to supply Germany. And other people saying there's no business case for that. So tell me what you think about energy today.
Well, energy is absolutely essential to a modern economy, Brian. We cannot have an economy. We can't even have our jobs or live in a warm house or turn on the lights without a steady supply of energy. So it's absolutely critical. We are in a transition. We're moving toward a clean energy, hopefully a net zero economy by 2050. It is a big stretch goal. We may not make it exactly at net zero, but that's the goal. And I support that. We have to deal with climate change, and we need to do all we can to make this transition to clean energy happen. But having said that, we can't ignore the fact that, for 150 years, we've had a fossil fuel-based energy system. And there are literally trillions of dollars of infrastructure invested in pipelines, electricity, grids, and other systems to support that. Now, all the major analysts of energy around the world, including and especially the International Energy Agency, acknowledge that we're going to continue to need oil and gas in particular, even out to 2050 and probably beyond. So nobody is saying that this is going to go to zero, despite what you might hear from some activists. the objective is to sort of trend down the use of fossil fuels and at the same time build out our infrastructure for renewables and clean energy. And when I talk about clean energy, I'm talking about emissions-free energy. So that could include fossil fuels with carbon capture technology, as well as nuclear, which also doesn't emit carbon, and renewables like wind and solar. So Canada needs a rational approach to energy. We don't actually have an energy strategy in Canada. Surprisingly enough, there's been a lot of talk over the years about needing one, but we don't have one. But we do have recently this critical mineral strategy that was released, and critical minerals are a part of our clean energy transition. So I include that in energy. But I think you raise an important point about demand for energy. We are a major producer of energy in the world, and we ship most of it south to the United States, but we have the capability now, and especially in the next couple of years, to export it offshore. And I'm talking about particularly the West Coast, where the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion is nearing completion. It's only about a year away from being able to export oil. And the LNG Canada project, which is a huge world-scale LNG project in Kitimat that's going to be exporting LNG mainly to the Indo-Pacific region. We don't currently have any export capacity on the East Coast. We could have had, but the Canadian government, because of regulatory permitting delays and environmental reviews and many other reasons, we just haven't been able to get a plant permitted there. There is some talk of fast tracking one, because after the war started in Ukraine and the Russians cut off Europe from natural gas supplies, those people are in dire need of natural gas. And we, as a supplier of natural gas, could be exporting LNG to Europe, helping them with their energy security. But we can't do that right now because we've been slow on the mark in getting an export terminal built on the East Coast. I know that our Prime Minister said that there's no business case for an LNG plant on the East Coast. That's flat wrong. There is, and I think the Natural Resources Minister would admit as much now, if he was being honest. There's certainly going to be the demand in Europe for some years to come, and so these terminals will be needed over a number of years. They ultimately may be able to be converted to hydrogen, which is something else that Canada wants to export going forward. So there are a lot of reasons why we really should have an export facility on the East Coast.
I understand that we're selling natural gas to the United States at like 10 or 20% of world prices, and then they're liquefying either that gas or their own gas and shipping it at 100%, so at 4 or 5 times what we sell it to them for. And yeah, I think you're right that it'll take a couple of years to certainly build pipelines and an LNG facility. But if you assume that Europe is going to be dependent on either Russian gas or some substitute, isn't this something that we should fast track and fast track it yesterday?
Absolutely. This should be an urgent issue to support our allies and partners in Europe, with which we, rhetorically, or, our government is always saying how much we support Europe, and we're allies in NATO and, upholders of the rules-based system in the world. But when it comes down to actually doing something to support them in the near and the medium term, it seems to be very difficult. We need to make this a priority. We need to fast track the permitting and the regulations. I'm not saying that we should skip important environmental reviews and those kinds of things, but there are lots of things that could be done to make this happen sooner rather than later and help out our European allies. And we should be doing that.
One would think with a war that looks damn like World War II going on in Europe today, with inflation, with with everything else that's going on, one would think that now's the time that it could actually get approved. Why hasn't it been fast-tracked? Why hasn't we've got the political capital, the political wherewithal to actually make this change and fast-track the regulatory approvals?
I have to think, Brian, it's unfortunately, I think a lot of the reasons are political. Our current government, well, of course, we all agree that climate change is real and we need to address it. There seems to be a feeling, at least in this government, that that means that we need to get off oil and gas immediately and immediately ramp up renewables and other clean energy sources. And that that also goes for our policy regarding, exports. There's not a lot of support for oil and gas in this government now because they believe that we need to transition away from it, and they're right. And we are transitioning, but the transition is going to take several decades. And in the meantime, as we see in Europe, we are very subject to suppliers like Russia, but there are others, including in the Middle East, that will use energy as a weapon. And if we're going to still be reliant on some degree of oil and gas, even in 2050, we don't want to be reliant on places in the Middle East and on Russia. We want to make sure that countries like Canada that can supply these products can continue to do so because we're a safe and reliable supplier. So we should establish ourselves. We should do everything we can to make sure we capture the emissions, but we should continue to supply the world through this transition because they're going to need these products to ensure their energy security. So there just seems to be a reluctance to admit this and put all the emphasis in policy and speeches on clean energy, perhaps for political reasons, but the actual reality on the ground is we're going to continue to need oil and gas for some time to come.
You also mentioned nuclear. Our Minister of the Environment, to understand, at one point in time was very anti-nuclear. I live in Ontario. I think most people think that we've got cleaner air today and we've been able to wean ourselves off of coal because of the significant contribution that nuclear plays in our electricity system here. What's the future that you think nuclear should play in our energy system in Canada?
I'm one of those people that feel that without nuclear power, we will not reach net zero by 2050. Absolutely. So nuclear is absolutely essential because nuclear, beyond being just carbon free, is a source of stable baseload power. And what I mean by that is when you turn on a nuclear plant, you can supply power steadily 24 hours a day. And so it doesn't depend on the sun shining or the wind blowing like windmills and solar panels do. And we need nuclear and we need other forms of stable baseload power like hydro to back up expansion of back up the expansion of renewables in our country so that we can continue to turn on the lights and heat our homes even at night and when the wind's not blowing. So we need that baseload power. We need it because if we want to reach net zero by 2050, that's one of the sources we need. In fact, what we need in Canada is an all of the above strategy where we use all energy sources, ensuring that we try to capture those emissions as much as possible so that we can have a stable and affordable energy system. And we can't forget about affordability because we can't do this at any cost. We have to make sure it's affordable for people as well.
You were the executive lead, head of the Energy Future Division at the Alberta Department of Energy at one point in time. You mentioned hydrogen. You mentioned carbon capture. Are these new technologies actually potentially available and could they be part of our energy future?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, carbon capture technology has been around now for 20 years probably, but we really haven't put it in place yet for various economic and other reasons. But now There is a large project going to be constructed in Alberta to capture and sequester carbon. I think that this is an area with this new tax credit, the Canadian government has supported companies to invest in carbon capture, and I'm anxiously waiting to see that companies take them up on this. So that's a very important technology we need to really put a focus on if we're going to continue to use oil and gas for some time to come. The other one you mentioned, sorry, what was the other?
Hydrogen.
Hydrogen, yes. Hydrogen is, a liquid fuel. Ultimately, it can be used to store energy, and so we can produce hydrogen in Canada from a number of sources. It can be produced from natural gas, or we can produce hydrogen from seawater using a certain process. We can produce it from, wind and solar power as well. And so it's a source of, the sources for hydrogen production can be clean energy, and hydrogen itself has no emissions. So hydrogen is, a lot of countries are looking to hydrogen to fill in some gaps. It's certainly not going to replace oil or gas, but in certain applications, like for fleet vehicles or for storing energy, it certainly has a lot of merit. So Canada is in a good position, actually, because we have a lot of clean energy sources like hydro in particular, where we can produce hydrogen and potentially export either the hydrogen or ammonia, which carries hydrogen, to other countries. And that can be another source of Canadian exports.
I happen to think that hydrogen, ammonia really are a potential solution because, as you mentioned, they don't carry carbon in them. They're either liquids or gases that don't contain any carbon molecules. And so if we could actually convert some of our hydrocarbons to ammonia or hydrogen and then ship that, we would get rid of all of the issues of carbon pollution and then carbon emissions later on in the whole supply chain process. And so I think it really could be a solution, and I wish we'd spend more time and energy doing research on that. We're going to take a break for some final messages and come back with some concluding comments from our guest, Dr. Jeff Kucharski, in just 2 minutes. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight has been Dr. Jeff Kucharski, who is really an expert both in Indo-Pacific issues as well as energy issues. He's shown that, very sufficiently, adequately, and substantially in our conversation today. And so thank you for that. He's also a professor of international business, and so undoubtedly could give us all suggestions on how we can make some money in this world of the future. Professor, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Canada's place in the world as you think about some of our listeners today, whether they're involved in politics or business or just interested in what's going on. We've talked about this new policy that Chrystia Freeland talked about in regards to authoritarian governments, the new policy that the Minister of Foreign Affairs has talked about in regards to our Indo-Pacific strategy. We're certainly, I think, thinking a lot more about our role in NATO, maybe even our role in the Arctic, concerns about what's going on in Ukraine and whether we should be investing more in military and defense. We're almost at the new year. We're thinking about 2023. Tell me a little bit about, the future of Canada in the world, if you could.
It's a big question, Brian, but it's an important one. I think that Canada is faced with, and not just Canada, but many countries that are friends with Canada, with a world that has really become unpredictable, volatile, in many ways, much more full of tension. We have a war in Ukraine, as you mentioned. We have a growing power in China, which they are hoping to use to bring China into a stronger role in the rest of the world. There are threats in the Indo-Pacific. We've got deglobalization trends. You know, the world is sort of moving into blocks, trading blocks, and friend shoring and supply chain realignments. And we've got economic instability as well, along with inflation and so on. So the world is confronted with a lot of challenges, and Canada has to deal with these as well. And so it's really important that we have a map. We have a map for how to navigate these, treacherous waters going forward. And I think I give credit to the government for coming out finally with an Indo-Pacific strategy, which will help us navigate in that region going forward. I give them credit for coming out with a critical mineral strategy, which is putting money behind their policies to support this sector, although I think it's probably not enough. And I think we as a nation, particularly our private sector, needs to step up now and start to engage more deeply in the world, recognizing these forces that are facing us, but not shrinking from them, but actually engaging out in the world and making new partnerships and alliances, and using the trade relations, the free trade agreements that Canada has established in the Indo-Pacific, in Europe, and elsewhere, and working with partners like the United States, Japan, and others to preserve our democratic values and the international rules-based order. These are going to be things we're going to hear about more going forward. We're going to be challenged from various authoritarian regimes, as we're seeing in Russia and China. But we need to be strong and move forward. Hopefully, we're going to have a peaceful transition to a better world of this century, but it may be fraught with bumps along the way. So we have to be ready.
Are you optimistic, sir, or pessimistic?
I'm hopeful. I think that at the end of the day, human beings, want to get along, and they have different perspectives on things. This is where diplomacy is really important. But at the same time, we have to stand up for our values and what we believe is absolutely essential and important, not only for us, but for our children and the future of our country. So we need to be strong, but we need to be hopeful that we can do this in a peaceful way as well. So I am hopeful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jeff Kucharski of Royal Roads University and the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, for joining us and talking to us about the Indo-Pacific relationship, about China, about Taiwan, about energy, and about your hopefulness for the future of Canada and the world. Really appreciate it.
You're most welcome. Thanks, Brian.
That's our show for tonight. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Victoria, British Columbia, at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.